Europe is changing, and not quietly. A new migration policy has arrived, and it is already splitting the continent in two. Some say it is the strongest reform in decades, finally bringing control to a system under pressure. Others warn it is a dangerous step, one that could reshape Europe's identity, its values, and its future. In this story, we explore what really happened, why the new rules were created, how they passed through a divided parliament, and most importantly, how these changes will affect real people, real borders, and real lives. You will learn English through the story of a continent standing at a crossroads. A story of politics, fear, hope, and the human struggle behind every decision. Welcome to WooEnglish. Let's begin. Chapter 1. The Policy That Split a Continent. Europe woke up to a new reality, and not everyone agreed on what it meant. Some called it a necessary step, an act of protection for a continent under pressure. Others called it a moral failure, a turning point that would haunt Europe for years. But no matter the opinion, one fact was clear. The new migration policy had divided a continent long before it was even implemented. The story did not begin with a vote. It began with fear, fatigue, and political noise growing louder every month. For years, Europe struggled with irregular arrivals across the Mediterranean and the Balkan routes. Numbers rose and fell, but the pressure never fully disappeared. Border states, Italy, Greece, Spain, Croatia, carried much of the burden. And while northern states offered support, they often argued over how much responsibility they should accept. Inside Brussels, the tension was familiar. Committees met, drafts circulated, ministers negotiated until late hours. Everyone agreed the system was broken. No one agreed on how to fix it. Then came a moment that changed the tone. A group of conservative and centrist politicians announced that Europe needed a stronger shield. Their message spread quickly across television, podcasts, and social media. They argued that open borders were no longer sustainable, and that migration must be controlled with far tougher rules. At first, critics dismissed the idea. They said it was political theater, a strategy for the next election cycle. But they were wrong. Public frustration had been building quietly. Border communities felt overwhelmed. Cities demanded more resources. Even moderate voters, who traditionally supported humanitarian approaches, started asking harder questions. Why are asylum systems overloaded? Why are deportations so slow? Why are some policies abused? These questions created a political environment ready for a major shift. The European Commission sensed this change. Conversations moved faster. Terms like deterrence, security, and responsibility sharing appeared more often in official documents. And behind closed doors, diplomats began shaping a reform that would soon become the center of Europe's biggest migration debate in years. The proposal arrived on a cold morning in Brussels. Journalists gathered outside the Parliament building. Cameras pointed toward the entrance. Officials stepped out with folders in their hands, faces serious, their silence louder than any announcement. Minutes later, the document was released to the public. Its contents spread across the news like wildfire. A tougher asylum process, new screening rules at borders, faster decisions, a shared list of safe countries, and the most controversial part of all, external return hubs, facilities outside EU territory where migrants with rejected claims could be sent. The reaction was immediate. Supporters said Europe was finally taking control of a chaotic system. They argued that without stronger rules, smugglers would continue to profit, human suffering would continue to rise, and trust in the EU would continue to fall. They claimed that stability required firmness, not hesitation. But critics saw something very different. They warned that external hubs risked violating human rights. They questioned whether safe countries were truly safe. They accused lawmakers of copying harsh immigration models from other nations, policies that Europe had once criticized. In cafes, offices, and living rooms, Europeans argued passionately. Some feared that lenient policies would attract more irregular migration. Others feared that harsh policies would destroy Europe's moral identity. And still, the debate intensified. Inside the European Parliament, the atmosphere grew heavier with every session. Speeches echoed through the hall, some calm, others emotional. A few members raised photographs of families displaced by war. Others pointed to maps of the Mediterranean, showing routes controlled by criminal networks. The divide became personal. The divide became visible. But politics is not only emotion, it is strategy. Conservative groups realized they could pass the reform if they secured support from the far-right blocs. It was a risky alliance, uncomfortable, criticized, and unexpected. Yet the numbers suggested it might work. And so, negotiations moved quietly into back rooms. Meanwhile, humanitarian organizations launched campaigns demanding the policy be rewritten. Thousands signed petitions. Activists marched in European capitals, carrying banners that read, "Protect people, not borders." Their voices were strong, but their influence was smaller than before. The political wind had changed direction. As the vote approached, Europe waited. Would the reform collapse under pressure, like so many before it? Or would it survive, reshaping the continent's approach to migration for a generation? The answer arrived in a narrow, striking vote. The numbers flashed on the digital board. Gasps filled the chamber. A few members applauded, others shook their heads silently. The policy had passed. Some celebrated it as a new shield for Europe. Others mourned it as a step backward for humanity. But either way, the continent had crossed a line, and there was no returning to the previous system. Europe did not choose unity. Europe chose division, hoping it would lead to control. Whether that hope becomes reality or regret, the next chapters will reveal. Chapter 2. Borders Under Pressure. Before Europe debated policies, before politicians argued in Parliament, the pressure began far away from microphones and meeting rooms. It began at the borders. Along the Mediterranean coastline, the sea glitters beautifully under the sun. But beneath its calm surface lies one of the most dangerous migration routes in the world. Greece, Italy, and Spain have watched this reality unfold for years. Each rescue operation, each arrival, each tragedy left a mark, not just on governments, but on local communities who live with the consequences every day. In the south of Italy, mayors speak about nights with no sleep. Boats appear unexpectedly. Dozens arrive in a single hour. Sometimes hundreds. Coast guards work until exhaustion. Shelters overflow. Hospitals struggle. volunteers face emotional and physical burnout. And all of this happens long before the European Union even reacts. For these frontline states, migration is not a debate. It is not theory. It is not numbers on a screen. It is daily life. On the Greek islands, the situation is no easier. Villages with a few thousand residents suddenly host camps larger than their populations. Children play near fences. Women wait in long lines for food. Men search for phone signals to contact families left behind. The islands feel the weight of geography. They stand at the door of Europe, unable to close it, unable to open it fully. Local economies feel the pressure. Tourism declines in some areas. Fishermen report tensions on the shore. Residents feel empathy one day, frustration the next. Emotions shift like the tides. And then there is the Balkan route, Croatia, Slovenia, and Hungary. Here the challenge is different, but just as real. Migrants travel through forests, railways, and abandoned roads. Border guards intercept groups at night, using flashlights to search the darkness. International law requires them to follow strict procedures, but in practice, the situation is chaotic. Each country claims its resources are overstretched. Each one points fingers at the other, and Europe watches the chain reaction unfold. This is the background that shaped the new migration policy. Without understanding the pressure at the borders, the reform makes no sense. With this context, the reform becomes predictable. The frontline states argued that they were being asked to protect the entire continent without sufficient help. Responsibility sharing was the promise of the old system, yet it rarely functioned properly. Countries in the north often refused to relocate migrants. Countries in the east opposed quotas entirely. The result, southern states felt abandoned. Northern states felt exploited. Eastern states felt ignored. A perfect recipe for tension. Italy became one of the most vocal critics of the old system. Its leaders argued that solidarity cannot be optional, and that Europe must either share the burden or redesign the system from the ground up. Greece supported this view. Spain supported it too, though with more caution. Even Cyprus, far from the Mediterranean crossings, reported unprecedented pressure. Year after year, these states asked for help. Year after year, the response was slow, divided, and politically complicated. The frustration reached a peak. When the new migration proposal appeared, border countries saw it as a chance to finally reshape the system in their favor. Many welcomed faster screenings at borders. Others supported the return hubs idea because it meant fewer long-term stays in their own territories. They believed strict control would discourage irregular arrivals and weaken smuggling networks. But here lies the complexity. What one region sees as protection, another region sees as punishment. Northern and Western countries feared that strict border measures would violate humanitarian standards. Human rights groups warned that desperate people would still come, but with fewer legal paths and more danger. Yet despite these warnings, pressure on the borders continued to grow. On the island of Lesbos, a Greek official described the situation in one sentence. "We are not a border of Greece. We are a border of Europe." This line captured everything. The frontline states wanted recognition, real, material recognition, not just sympathy. In Spain, local authorities faced similar challenges. Arrivals in the Canary Islands increased sharply, stretching rescue teams to their limits. The Atlantic route is longer, more dangerous, and more unpredictable than the Mediterranean. Boats disappear. Weeks later, wreckage appears on distant shores. Families thousands of miles away wait for news that never comes. These tragedies shape the political landscape. They influence elections. They strengthen or weaken governments. And they fuel emotions that eventually shape policy decisions in Brussels. From the perspective of border states, Europe had two choices: share responsibility or tighten the system. Europe chose the second. Whether that choice brings stability or new problems remains uncertain. But one thing is clear. Without the experiences of Greece, Italy, Spain, Croatia, and others, without their exhaustion, frustration, and repeated warnings, the migration reform would never have passed. The pressure at the borders was not just physical, it was emotional, it was political. It was the force that pushed Europe to rewrite its laws. As this chapter closes, a question remains. If the borders carry the weight of the continent, who carries the weight of the borders? Chapter 3: The Rise of Return Hubs. The debate over migration had many sharp edges, but none was sharper than the creation of Europe's new return hubs. These facilities, planned outside European Union territory, became the heart of the controversy. Critics called them inhumane. Supporters called them necessary. And between those extremes stood millions who simply tried to understand what Europe was becoming. The idea did not appear suddenly. It grew slowly, shaped by years of political tension and administrative failures. European governments struggled to deport migrants whose asylum claims were rejected. Some individuals disappeared before authorities could enforce the decision. Others lived in legal limbo, unable to stay, unable to leave. This created frustration among governments, confusion among citizens, and despair among migrants. Something had to change, or at least that was the belief inside several European capitals. The return hubs promised a solution. According to the proposal, these hubs would operate in partner countries outside the EU. Migrants who received negative asylum decisions would be transferred there for temporary accommodation until they could be sent back to their country of origin. On paper, it seemed efficient. In practice, it raised a storm. Human rights organizations were the first to sound the alarm. They questioned the safety of these partner countries. They raised concerns about legal transparency. They warned that Europe might outsource its responsibilities, its moral duties, to poorer nations willing to accept financial compensation in exchange for political favors. The accusations were heavy. Europe is exporting its problem, some activists said. Europe is avoiding its obligations, others added. But the debate was far more complex than slogans. To understand the rise of these hubs, one must examine the political climate. Far-right parties across Europe were gaining influence, often using migration as their main campaign weapon. Their success pressured centrist and conservative governments to appear tougher. Meanwhile, frontline states demanded relief from overwhelming border arrivals. They pushed for faster procedures and quicker removals. These forces created an unusual alliance of border countries that felt abandoned. governments trying to survive elections, and political groups seeking strict control of immigration. The return hubs were the compromise that brought them together. Inside meeting rooms in Brussels, diplomats argued over every detail. How long could migrants stay in these hubs? Who would monitor conditions? What legal rights would individuals maintain? Which countries would host them? The negotiations were tense. Some EU members refused to participate. Others insisted the hubs must remain temporary solutions. But a small group pushed strongly, arguing that without external processing, Europe's asylum system would collapse under the weight of irregular migration. The idea gained momentum when several non-EU countries expressed interest in hosting the hubs, particularly nations seeking stronger diplomatic ties with Europe. These countries hoped for financial investment, visa agreements, or trade advantages. Their governments assured the EU they could manage the facilities responsibly, but activists doubted those assurances. European citizens were equally divided. Some feared the hubs would create new humanitarian crises. Others feared that without them, irregular migration would increase. Parents, workers, students, ordinary people found themselves in heated discussions at dinner tables and offices. What kind of Europe do we want? That question echoed from newspapers to television studios. Supporters of the hubs repeated one argument. Europe's system needed order. Too many people were entering without clear grounds for asylum. Too many decisions were delayed. Too many deportations were never executed. They believed the hubs would break this cycle by applying quick, firm, and transparent procedures. Yet critics saw something darker. They argued the hubs would limit legal protections. They feared rushed decisions. They warned that once people left EU territory, their rights would weaken. They asked whether Europe could still claim to be a global defender of human dignity. The truth lay somewhere between idealism and necessity. Behind the political noise, a quieter reality existed. Thousands of migrants were stuck in Europe with no path forward. Families lived for years waiting for decisions. Some children grew up in shelters, never knowing stability. The hubs, if implemented correctly, could reduce these long limbo situations, but only if strict oversight ensured fairness. Still, the symbolism of the hubs was powerful. For many, it represented Europe closing its doors. For others, it represented Europe finally taking control of its borders. When the reform passed, the reaction was immediate. Some celebrated with relief. Others protested in city squares. Humanitarian lawyers prepared legal challenges. Diplomats prepared new agreements. Journalists prepared headlines. But for those who would be sent to these hubs, the future was uncertain. What conditions would they face? How long would they remain there? Would their rights be protected? These questions remain unanswered. As this chapter ends, one truth becomes clear. Europe's return hubs are more than administrative tools. They are symbols. Symbols of fear, responsibility, power, and doubt. Whether they bring order or deepen the crisis, the next years will decide. Chapter 4. Safe Countries, or Political Illusion. When Europe expanded its list of safe countries, the announcement sounded simple, almost technical. A short press release, a few lines of legal explanation, nothing dramatic on the surface. But beneath those lines, a storm was already forming. The term safe country carries enormous weight in asylum law. It determines who gets protection, who gets rejected quickly, and who is sent to a return hub. It is more than a label. It is a decision that shapes the futures of thousands. For years, Europe struggled with slow asylum procedures. Applications piled up faster than governments could review them. Some cases took months. Others took years. This created long waiting periods, overcrowded shelters, and frustration for both migrants and officials. Expanding the list of safe countries promised a solution. If more countries were officially considered safe, then claims from those regions could be processed rapidly, with simplified procedures and fewer appeals. At least that was the theory. But as often happens in politics, theory and reality do not walk the same road. The new list included nations with complicated internal situations, countries experiencing political pressure, social unrest, or regional instability. Some governments insisted these nations were stable enough. Human rights groups insisted the opposite. The debate became fierce. Supporters of the expansion argued that Europe needed efficiency. They claimed most migrants from these countries were coming for economic reasons, not escaping danger. They pointed to statistics showing low acceptance rates for asylum seekers from these regions. If 90% are rejected anyway, one official said, why should we take a year to reach that decision? Why not process it in weeks? But critics responded with a different question. Who decides what is safe? And according to whose experience, politicians or the people fleeing? The more the list expanded, the more doubts grew. Some countries resented being labeled safe. Their governments felt Europe was ignoring internal conflicts. They feared diplomatic consequences. They accused the EU of using the word safe as a geopolitical convenience, not a factual judgment. Inside the European Parliament, the arguments were intense. Some members described the list as an illusion of security, a political tool designed to control migration numbers rather than reflect reality on the ground. Others warned that the definition of safe must not be influenced by trade deals, military partnerships, or diplomatic negotiations. But these concerns did not stop the reform. Behind closed doors, pressure was rising. Border states demanded faster procedures. Northern states demanded stronger guarantees that asylum systems would not collapse. Eastern states demanded protection from irregular transit routes, and governments facing elections demanded a message to voters: we are taking action. The expanded safe country list became that message. Migrants felt the impact immediately. Applications from newly listed countries were pushed into accelerated procedures. Decisions came faster, sometimes within days. Appeals were limited, and transfer to return hubs became more likely. For many, the process felt like a door closing before they could speak. Some lawyers described it as procedural silence, a system where the outcome was already determined and the individual story barely mattered. Humanitarian groups warned that people with genuine risks might slip through the cracks, rejected too quickly to prove their case. Yet governments insisted the system remained fair. They argued that accelerated procedures still followed legal standards. They emphasized that individuals could still appeal if they demonstrated personal danger. They repeated that reform was essential. This tension, efficiency versus protection, became the core of the debate. The more Europe focused on speed, the more critics asked whether justice was being sacrificed. The more Europe emphasized control, the more migrants questioned whether their voices were truly heard. The controversy reached another level when some partner countries, newly labeled safe, faced sudden outbreaks of violence or political instability. Journalists asked whether the list would be updated. Officials hesitated. Updating the list would slow the process again. Not updating it would weaken Europe's moral credibility. It was a difficult choice with no clean answer. In many ways, the safe country list revealed an uncomfortable truth about global politics. Safety is not always objective. Safety can be influenced by alliances, by negotiations, by economic interests. And when Europe uses safety as a legal category, those influences become part of the asylum system. The consequences extend beyond statistics. For a mother escaping domestic threats, for a student avoiding political persecution, for a family fleeing local conflict in a generally safe nation, the difference between safe and unsafe is not a legal definition. It is a matter of survival. Yet the system cannot function without categories. Law requires structure. Governments require order. The tension between individual truth and political necessity remains unresolved. As this chapter ends, Europe faces a difficult question. If safety becomes a political tool, can justice remain neutral? Chapter 5. Inside the Parliament Battle. The debate that shaped Europe's new migration policy did not unfold quietly. It erupted inside one of the most contested political arenas in the world, the European Parliament. Here, under bright lights and high ceilings, alliances were forged, broken, rebuilt, and tested again. The reform did not pass because everyone agreed. It passed because politics, pressure, and survival collided at the perfect moment. From the outside, parliamentary sessions look calm. Formal speeches, polite applause, controlled discussions. But inside, the atmosphere is electric. Every word carries weight. Every silence hides strategy. And every vote can change the continent's direction. The migration reform reached Parliament after months of negotiations between diplomats and ministers. It entered the chamber like a storm. Everyone had an opinion, and almost no one was neutral. The speakers' list filled quickly. Some prepared thoughtful arguments. Others prepared emotional appeals. A few prepared political attacks. On the morning of the debate, members gathered early. Folders in hand, notes prepared, faces tense. The first speaker stepped forward. A centrist representative opened the session with a calm, steady voice. He argued that Europe needed order in the chaos, and that the new rules were essential for stability. He spoke of overwhelmed borders, exhausted communities, and a system that no longer functioned. His message was simple. If Europe cannot manage migration, Europe cannot protect itself. Applause followed, but not from everyone. A Green Party member rose next. Her tone was sharper, her expression firm. She accused the reform of sacrificing human dignity for political convenience. She warned that outsourcing asylum responsibilities to non-EU countries would lead to abuses and legal gray zones. "This is not a solution," she said. "This is an escape from responsibility." Her words struck the chamber. and murmurs rippled across the seats. But the true battle emerged between two powerful blocs, the conservatives and the far right. For years, they disagreed on many issues. Yet on migration, their interests aligned more than anyone expected. Conservatives wanted a reform that showed voters they were in control. Far-right parties wanted a reform that matched their long-standing demands for strict border enforcement. Together, they held enough seats to tip the balance, if they cooperated. Behind the scenes, negotiations began. Not publicly, not formally, but in quiet rooms, over urgent phone calls, during private meetings where no cameras were allowed. Conservative leaders approached far-right groups with a message. Support this reform, and Europe will move closer to your vision of border control. It was a risky alliance. Conservatives feared criticism from moderates. Far-right parties feared betraying their voters if the reform was not strict enough. But both sides also feared something greater: losing influence in a rapidly changing Europe. The center-left, meanwhile, tried to build a counter-alliance. They appealed to liberal, green, and socialist groups. They warned that the reform would damage Europe's global reputation. They argued that the policy was rushed, incomplete, and potentially unlawful. Their speeches were passionate, some even emotional. One member held up a photograph of a young girl who had drowned in the Mediterranean. His voice trembled as he spoke. "This reform will not stop tragedies. It will only hide them." Silence fell across the chamber. But emotion alone could not win the vote. Hours later, a Slovak representative aligned with the far right delivered a speech that shifted the mood. He argued that uncontrolled migration created fear in his community. Fear of crime, fear of cultural change, fear of losing identity. He insisted the reform would restore confidence in the Union. His speech was powerful not because it was right, but because it reflected a fear shared by millions across Europe. Fear drives politics. And in this moment, fear became a decisive force. When the debate ended, the vote began. Names flashed across screens: green for approval, red for rejection, yellow for abstention. The numbers changed fast, too fast for some members to process. Hands shook. Whispers filled the room. Every second felt heavier than the last. Then, the final count appeared. The reform had passed. Gasps echoed. Some members stood and applauded. Others sat motionless, stunned. A few shook their heads in disbelief. Reporters rushed to their cameras. Phones buzzed across Europe. Social media exploded with reactions: celebrations, anger, confusion, fear. Inside the parliament, the divide was visible. The alliance between conservatives and far-right members had succeeded. Moderates felt defeated. Humanitarians felt betrayed. Border states felt relieved. But the story did not end with the vote. The reform had passed, yes, but the questions remained. Would it work? Would it survive legal challenges? Would partner countries honor their commitments? And most importantly, would Europe become safer or simply colder? As the chamber slowly emptied, one senior member offered a quiet reflection. History will judge us. Not today, not tomorrow, but soon. The battle inside Parliament was over. The consequences outside it were just beginning. Chapter 6. Human Stories in a Harder System. When politicians speak about migration, they speak in numbers, graphs, charts, percentages. But the migration system is not built from numbers. It is built from people, and people do not fit neatly inside statistics. Europe's new policy, designed to be faster, stricter, more controlled, changed the lives of thousands long before the public understood its real impact. Some found clarity. Some found fear. Others found themselves caught in a system that moved too quickly for their voices to be heard. This chapter does not analyze laws. It listens to stories. In a reception center in southern Italy, a young man named Farid sits on a metal bed, clutching a small phone. He escaped a region labeled safe on Europe's new list, even though his personal experience had been anything but safe. His asylum interview lasted only a few minutes, a few questions, a few answers, a quick decision, rejected. Not because his story lacked truth, but because the system now processed people from his country with accelerated procedures. A label decided his fate before he even entered the room. Now he waits for transfer to a return hub outside the EU. He has no idea where it is. He has no idea how long he will stay. He has no idea what comes next. He scrolls through his messages. No signal from home. No updates. No comfort. Farid is not a symbol. He is a person navigating a system designed to move faster than his truth. Across the Mediterranean, on a Greek island, a family celebrates a different outcome. A mother and her 2 children finally receive protection status after years of uncertainty. The new policy, while strict, also created clearer paths for certain categories of asylum seekers, especially those fleeing recognized conflicts. Their case was processed in weeks, not years. For the first time in a long time, they feel a sense of stability. The children smile as they explore the beach outside the shelter. The mother presses her hands together in quiet relief. Europe, for them, became a place of safety. This is the part people often forget. Even strict systems can produce positive outcomes when the process becomes more structured. But not everyone benefits equally. Near the Croatian border, a group of young men walks through a forest at night. They carry no documents, no warm clothes, just hope. The new EU policy includes stronger border enforcement, which means more patrols and more pressure on people trying to cross irregularly. Some of these men have tried multiple times. Each attempt ends the same way: detained, registered, sent back to the country from which they entered. They know the law is against them, but their circumstances push them forward again and again. The reform aims to stop this cycle, but desperation does not disappear when laws become tougher. In Spain, on the Canary Islands, the situation shows another side of the story. Arrival numbers have surged due to instability in West Africa. Local authorities work tirelessly, rescuing boats, providing medical aid, organizing shelters. But after the policy change, pressure grows fast. More people are classified for accelerated procedures. More cases are denied. More deportation processes begin immediately. A social worker, exhausted but determined, shares her worry. The system is faster, but the people are still fragile. She watches teenagers sit silently in the corner of a shelter, boys who crossed the Atlantic on wooden boats, boys who lost friends on the journey. They face rapid decisions now. But trauma does not move on a timetable. Then there are the communities, ordinary citizens who live near the borders or in cities where reception centers operate. Some feel relief. They believe the new policy will reduce pressure on local services, restore order, and prevent overcrowding. Tourism workers in Greece hope their villages can recover their reputation. Italian fishermen hope fewer boats will cross their waters. Spanish educators hope the school system will function more smoothly. Others feel uneasy. They fear that harsh rules will damage Europe's moral identity. They fear that rapid deportations will silence legitimate stories of danger. They fear that these policies, while stricter, do not address the deeper causes of migration. The continent is divided not only politically, but emotionally. The real weight of the new system becomes clear when a humanitarian doctor in Lesbos speaks about her patients. She treats people from different countries, different languages, different histories. But she sees the same expressions again and again: fear, confusion, exhaustion. She explains, "A tougher system can work if it is fair, but fairness requires time. Time to listen. Time to understand. Time to judge a person's story, not their nationality." Her words echo a truth that laws often overlook. Speed may create order, but speed can also erase nuance. As we step back from these stories, one reality emerges. Europe's new migration policy is not simply a political project. It is a human experiment, its results measured not in documents or votes, but in lives altered, hopes delayed, and futures rewritten. Some migrants find safety faster. Others are denied it faster. Some communities feel protected. Others feel conflicted. The system is running harder, faster, stricter. But people do not move like systems. They move like hearts. Unpredictable, vulnerable, persistent. Chapter 7. Europe's Future. Control or compassion. Europe stands at a crossroads, not a physical one, but a moral, political, and emotional intersection where choices shape the continent's identity. The new migration reform, already dividing governments and communities, is more than a set of policies. It is a mirror, reflecting who Europeans believe they are and who they fear they might become. The question now is simple, and yet impossibly heavy. What kind of future does Europe want? When the reform passed, supporters celebrated what they called a new era of control. For them, the old system was chaotic: slow procedures, overwhelmed borders, and endless debates that went nowhere. They believed Europe needed discipline, clear rules, and the strength to enforce them. In their view, compassion without structure becomes instability. And instability, they argued, threatens Europe's security, trust, and political unity. Their message echoed across newspapers, podcasts, and political rallies. If Europe cannot manage migration, then Europe cannot protect itself. For many citizens worried about rapid demographic changes, economic pressure, or cultural tensions, this message felt logical, even comforting. But not everyone found comfort in control. Opponents of the reform looked at the same policies and felt something entirely different. They saw borders hardening, rights weakening, and solidarity fading. They feared that Europe, once a global symbol of human dignity and post-war humanitarianism, was slowly turning away from its values. They asked difficult questions. Can we call ourselves a community of principles if we send people to return hubs far away? Can we claim moral leadership if safe country labels silence individual stories of danger? Can we safeguard democracy if fear becomes the foundation of our decisions? For these critics, compassion is not weakness. It is the foundation of Europe's strength. This divide, control versus compassion, is not new. Europe has struggled with it for decades. But today, the stakes feel higher. The world is shifting quickly. Conflicts erupt, economies fluctuate. Climate change forces entire communities to migrate. Political parties rise and fall based on how they address or exploit public emotions surrounding migration. Europe's future will not be shaped by laws alone. It will be shaped by how societies respond to change. To understand the path ahead, we must look at three forces shaping Europe's decisions. 1. Political pressure. Governments across the continent face rising nationalist movements demanding stricter immigration control. Election cycles push leaders to adopt sharper messages. The migration reform reflects this pressure, a political force that is unlikely to disappear. 2. Humanitarian responsibility. Despite political divisions, millions of Europeans still believe in moral duty. NGOs, volunteers, teachers, social workers, and ordinary families continue to support newcomers. Their presence keeps compassion alive inside the system, even when laws become tougher. 3. Economic reality. Ironically, while Europe tightens migration rules, it also suffers labor shortages in agriculture, healthcare, construction, and technology. Demographers warn that Europe needs workers. Strict policies may satisfy voters, but they could harm economies in the long term. This contradiction sits quietly in the background, waiting to explode in future debates. In the middle of these forces stand migrants themselves, people who do not move to change Europe, but to change their own lives. Some will find a place here, others will be sent away. Many will continue risking their lives on dangerous routes because the global pressures pushing them to move are stronger than any border policy. Migration is not a challenge that laws can fully control. It is a human phenomenon, rooted in survival. So where does this leave Europe? Perhaps the answer lies not in choosing control or compassion, but in learning how to balance them. A system without control collapses. A system without compassion loses its soul. The question is not whether Europe can control its borders. It can. The question is whether Europe can do so while honoring the dignity of those who seek protection. Some policymakers argue that the reform is only a first step, that its success depends on implementation, oversight, and future adjustments. If the hubs are monitored fairly, if the safe country list is reviewed honestly, if screenings remain humane, then Europe may find a middle path. But that is a long list of ifs, and history shows that systems built for efficiency often become systems built for exclusion if they are not carefully watched. As this chapter closes, Europe's future remains uncertain. The continent has chosen a path, harder, sharper, more controlled. But the story is far from over. In the years ahead, courts may challenge the reform. Elections may reshape it. Public opinion may soften or harden. Crises may force Europe to reconsider everything again. What is certain is this: migration will continue. Human movement will not stop because laws become stricter. People will keep crossing seas, deserts, borders, because hope is stronger than fear. And Europe must decide, again and again, how to respond. Will it lean toward protection, or toward compassion, or toward something in between? The answer will define not only the continent's policies, but its identity. For now, Europe stands at the crossroads, its choice made, its consequences unfolding, its future unwritten.